as a person who grew up in the U.S., my mother was born in France. Her father was an official from Guinea-Conakry and from the Touré family of Almami. And my mother didn't grow up with his culture because of the fracture of the decolonization process between France and Africa. So she didn't have that African culture. Married my father, moved to America. My father is proper Mundere in Lingala as a person of European heritage. Right? So I grew up there, and African American culture, brilliant, beautiful, amazing, vibrant, resilience, innovation, everything you could want, but not African, which is fine, but I knew that I had West African heritage and I couldn't find it. So I started collecting African textiles from the age of 13.
Yes.
And any chance I could get to go to an African dance class or some kind of African function or an African restaurant, I started doing that as much as I could and keeping every single morsel that I could have to claim that. Moved to France, learned French, started working in geopolitics, went to Nigeria, Ghana, Congo, South Africa, to trace my family. In that, I wanted to address the colonial inequalities that persist in the African continent and the erasure of African cultures, identities, languages, religions, which also led me to be in Afro-Latin dance. So in America, missing the African culture, I found it among the Caribbean people. And in Afro-Cuban culture, they practice both Nigerian and Congolese culture. They still sing in Congolese languages in Cuba. They continue to practice religions that are not necessarily as practiced among Congolese nations and Nigerian religions. And so through dance, I actually am an Afro-Latin dance instructor. I've been teaching salsa, merengue, bachata. I've done palo, religious dance, which is Congolese, Nigerian religious dance, which is Cuban. And so besides the work that I do in mining and metals, there's also the embodiment of that African identity that African Americans still maintain. African American dance is African dance. And trying to connect those dots with diasporic people who may not feel connected to Africa, multi-heritage people who might not feel connected to Africa, African American people who might not feel connected to Africa. It's connecting economics, industry, dance, fashion, art. So to add a little bit, to be on the arts panel here. So thank you.
It's undeniable that Congolese music has a global influence, right? And in most parts of the world, our music is recognized and celebrated. But what, other than Congolese music, would you say is a dominant or prevalent aspect of Congolese culture that you've seen in the world?
So from outside of Congo, in the Americas, I find it really compelling that people of African heritage maintain Congolese cultural traditions, Congolese languages that they may not fluently speak. We may be singing religious songs that have been handed down with rhythms that go with those religious songs, with dances that go with those religious songs from people who were taken from Africa in the transatlantic slave trade. So there is the nurturing and the protection of these sacred traditions, which are still carried by African heritage people and their descendants, and people who love African diaspora cultures who are not African at all. So I went to, here in London, a Palo Mayombe Congolese religious music course from an Italian man who lives in Cuba. He lives in Cuba and he is a master. He is initiated in both Palo Mayombe, which is a derivative diasporic Congolese-derived religious practice, and what is called Lukumi, which is a Nigerian Ifa-derived religious practice. And he's white, but he's a master of this to the point where he's invited to African spaces to teach Congolese language music via Cuba, via Italy. And so you'll get this also in Brazil and anywhere where African, well also, if you look at the globe and you look at, if you ever go to the Natural History Museum, there's a magnificent, huge 3D globe that has a projection of ocean currents. You're thinking, why is this important? The ocean swirls from the Indian Ocean, it swirls down past Madagascar, it swirls under South Africa, it swirls up, it hits Pointe Noire in the Republic of Congo, and it shoots to the Caribbean. So what the European colonizers did, which was a tragedy, is they took people from all over West Africa down the coast to Pointe Noire and shipped people off to the Caribbean. So among the diasporic populations in the Caribbean is Congolese, Cameroonian, Nigerian, Senegalese, Ghanaian, and it's all in there. So when diasporic African people are unpacking what they've maintained in dance moves, Congo's in there.
And it's so interesting that you say that, because I think very often when I'm having conversations with friends from different countries, and when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, most people believe that it's just from West Africa that people were transported from. So it's a really interesting fact to hear. I'm not sure if anybody knew this information already, because that was new to me. That's restored me to it.
And also the cultural value of being very, very well dressed. Sape. Yeah, that's also translated.
Psychology.
Yes. So the importance of looking good and dressing well, no matter your income, is really important culturally, and it's actually culturally offensive to dress badly, in Congo. And that's very remarkable. So it's something, as an outsider, non-Congolese remarks. Appreciate.
I want to ask you a quick question before you pass on to Christelle. What do you think the attraction is to? I'm just thinking about the Italian teacher that you were talking about, and obviously you've also ventured into that world. What was your attraction to those dance forms and that particular religious medium that you're talking about?
Thank you for asking that question. So, among the people in the diaspora and also people on the continent, many of us have lost connection to our traditional religions prior to the arrival of Islam on the continent in the 600s and the arrival of Christianity via the Europeans. Because obviously Christianity was in Africa, in Egypt, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan, directly from Israel, Palestine, right? But the arrival of colonial religions and making you lose your religion and your language, that happened to my Ghanaian ancestors, who are currently mostly Muslim, which is beautiful. Islam is beautiful. But I wanted to know what was before Islam. So in America, I was like, well, what's African tradition? What is it? Can I find some? What were my ancestors practicing? And there was no Ghanaian religious community. So I found Afro-Cuban. And it was Africa. I'm like, well, neighbor, can I try this on? And the viscerality of feeling African rhythms and having a body that does move that way, in your bones dance. And, I was performing at university level with master choreographers who were also religious practitioners. So Afro-Cuban religious choreographer, Afro-Brazilian religious choreographer. So it's religion. So if you are Christian and you do dances in your church, well, Congolese religions have dances that go with the music, that goes with the rhythm, that have been maintained for centuries. And that's powerful. That we love Congo so much that we'll hide it within Catholicism, within Christianity, and it's still there. Even if you go to church, you might see that you're dancing moves or using rhythms that were from your religion before. So I think there's a way to blend who you are now and value what your people created in the past as something essential. Thank you.
Making insights into Congo's influence in the diaspora and other aspects of Congolese culture. Anything that we haven't covered so far?
So I might slightly go off piste, but it should answer your question in a way. So you might see there's this panel behind me here, which is a piece of artwork and academic research. So this particular piece is called Zoki, but I was corrected by Kazadi's mom. It should say Nzoka, but so there's a debate there, which means regret. So this piece was actually started because I was working with a British colleague, ethnically British colleague, who we were supposed to look at colonial images from the mid-1800s of mining in Africa, because I work with mining in Africa. He kept bringing me disturbing images. And I didn't want to curate those.
Right.
Because in order to curate an exhibition of disturbing content, you need to work very closely with people to make sure that you're not traumatizing them, hurting them, embarrassing them, shaming them. And so we actually fought about this, and he dropped out with half the funding. Fine. So I said, you know what, I'm going to take that image you showed me, I'm going to blur it out, I'm going to censor it, and I'm going to put it in the exhibition with traditional Congolese textiles from the 1800s, raffia, because I know from my experience working with traditional leaders in Congo, some only wear raffia, and it's sacred. And I met one of the kings. The Republic of Congo has four kings. So it's the king of Rwanda, the king of the Teke, the king of the Boshi, and you have another king, and he only wore raffia. And he was a very sacred person who didn't have freedom of movement because he was an authority over forest spirits and water spirits. And this is in the Vili region of the Loango kingdom. right? So which was previously much larger kingdom. And so the idea of returning sacredness, returning honor and respect to images from the past is the center of this particular exhibition. And I wanted to also compare it to images of the regality of Congolese culture. The amazing artistry, blacksmith work, equestrian culture. So we have here an image of the Moudin Cavalier. So there's the horse riders of the Moudin. And so this is, descendant of the Arab expansion who brought horses. The horses come from Arabia, and the equestrian culture across Africa is an evolution on the arrival of horses through the expansion of Islam, and how it began to be innovated with Congolese culture and textiles and leatherwork and metalwork, and the amount of culture you need to have dozens and dozens of well-dressed horses. That's huge. That's huge. And these type of images are in European archives. So you can go and find these images, and they're magnificent. And this is what we should be saying about Africa from the 1800s. Because there's so much that we've lost, and I think the more that we show and feature Congolese artistry, Congolese culture, Congolese empires, the more people will visit who they think they are.
Absolutely.
And the more you can say to people who detract from Africa, you actually don't know what you're talking about. You come to our country and take our art and put it in your museums.
Ooh! Yeah! Excellent pop over there. Excellent. We're going in the right direction because this is obviously his area. So I love what you said about blurring out those traumatic images, because I do feel that there is this overuse of certain types of images when it comes to Africa, when it comes to Congo. And I suppose for the diaspora, it's very difficult to maintain a sense of pride if you don't have this information and these stories and these artifacts, and all you see is that. So I really appreciate you bringing that to me. Thank you, Madeleine. If we come to you, I have a question for you, which looks to what was spoken about. So, how many artists had a significant impact on European wonders like Picasso and Matisse? Can you elaborate on how these artists were influenced by traditional Congolese sculptures and masks, and what elements they adopted into their own work?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. I think that is, for me, the missing piece in actually understanding the role of Congolese cultural commodities being consumed in the West, right? And there are basically a number of elements that you need to understand, right? First of all, art in the way that we look at it is really from a Western canon, right? Um, so the sculptures, the masks that we're seeing, a lot of us don't really have any connection, or there is no sensation that occurs when we're looking into that, right? Simply because we don't have the knowledge in how to unlock that.
Right.
So if we look at the artistry, don't really want to dive into it, but there are elements of the Renaissance which really had a profound impact in how Western artistic practices were being produced, distributed, and consumed. Right? So these are the three important things. And what they were trying to do was to create artworks that were resembling their own liking.
Right.
They wanted to capture natural elements, but it was also heavily influenced by Christianity. Right? Christianity played a key role into that. So at some point within the artistry, if you look into it, there is always a break from one period to another period. And when we talk about the modernism, with the modernist era, we're basically talking about the avant-garde area, right? You got people like Pablo Picasso, Matisse, Chagall. These were people that were looking for something new. They wanted to add something to their practice. So the story goes that in 1906, Pablo Picasso was presented with a Congolese sculpture, a kisi sculpture. Okay, so for them, that group of people, it really created something new inside of them. It inspired them. Story goes that Picasso actually slept with this kissy statue for days because he was so amazed with what he was seeing, the form, the shape, the geometry of it. He just couldn't understand it. You could argue that maybe the actual spirituality in those sculptures inspired him. We don't know, we're not there, but there is clearly something that happened there. From there on, what we're actually seeing is that a number of individuals are starting to look into these sculptures. And I think it's also very important to understand that 90% of all these sculptures and masks are outside of Africa.
Right.
Right, 90%. And we're talking about thousands and thousands. And back then, it had a significant value because it filled all these museums, or ethnographic museums. And they named it primitive art, right? Primitive because I think personally they didn't understand what they were seeing, but primitive in a way of showing Western superiority over other cultures and using it as a tool to justify colonization, but also to justify the ability to take something that is precious, which has meaning to a people, right? And basically display it as art. For us, it wasn't art. But if you look at Picasso, you could say for him, it wasn't art either. It was something much deeper into that. So you have this 25-year-old young man trying to find his way into the art world, trying to make a mark. And you got these Congolese sculptures inspiring him and resolving into this art piece, right? Our Les Damoiselles d'Avignon. I'm not sure if you are also familiar with that. And there we can see subjects, elements of Congolese masks, right? And I would argue Picasso was actually the first Congolese modernist artist, right? We have the right to reclaim that.
Absolutely.
Right? But on top of that, we don't know who these artists were, who made these works, right? So the question that comes, which I'll conclude, is how can we connect with that piece of art that captures the essence of our culture, of our existence? We might not be able to understand it, but we have the right to access it. And funnily enough, we can access it here in Europe. We don't have to go back to Africa to access it. It's all here in all these museums, right? So that piece of information, I think for a lot of artists, unlocked, Congolese artists, contemporary artists, unlocked a lot because they then realize, wait a minute, we are all inspired by Picasso. We all want to do something like Picasso, but then it turns out that Picasso was inspired by Congolese sculptures. There's clearly something wrong there.
It's the root back, isn't it? Thank you so much for that. That's a list. The rich people in
Thank you. I want to shift the focus slightly. Obviously, Christella's introduced the work that she does, so she's very much in the fashion field, and I'm going to ask a question. There was a word that was mentioned earlier, which is sapology, which some of you may already know, and some of you are coming with the essence of the sap today, showing up. I suppose for Christella, I wanted, we can't really discuss Congolese fashion without touching on sapology. Could you take us back to the origins of sapology and its deeper cultural significance in Congolese society? We might need to explain it also for some people who aren't so sure of what that is.
Sure. So sapology is a subculture that has its origins as far back as the 1900s. It derives from the Democratic Republic of Congo, but has also filtered and inspired also our neighbours, Congolese. Essentially, it started when the colonial settlers were working in Central Africa, and Congolese workers were very inspired by the clothing and the dresses that the French colonies were wearing. We also had within the group of people, les évolués, which were essentially Congolese people that saw themselves as educated, that were also inspired by that. So it was a way in which they would class themselves as more opulent and more elegant dresses to go with also their status, as for instance. I do think that there's been, over the years, there's been a lot of changes in the way in which sapology has evolved. It's not just about what people think as being showing off, the expensive designers and so forth. What we have today is a subculture that has evolved where it really is about showing our identity, national pride, and also what we find is with the younger generation, they're also mixing name brands, for example, with just African attire, and really showing our own unique way and unique take of this. And if sapology, or la Sape for short, stands for, in English, sapology stands for Society of Ambiance Makers and Elegant People, because as Congolese people,
Can you say it again? It's just so good. Say it with your whole chest, because I just love it.
So it's Society of Ambiance Makers and Elegant People. So I think there has to be a new way in which we look at sapology, and through my research, when I went into it, I really did think it was about, showing off and really, going into spaces and really, taking over spaces the way you look and the way you carry yourself. But I've come to understand it's about confidence, it's about celebration, celebrating our Congolese identity, which I think it's very important for us as Congolese people, and to embrace that, and not look down on people that see themselves as sapeurs. And despite not having much, as Congolese people, we still have our pride in our sense of identity. So essentially going against the stigmas that we're no longer colonized people, but we are people that have our own identity, we are people that are, see ourselves as high regard, and we carry ourselves and express ourselves through this art form. So it has to be embraced.
Yes. It's quite radical. It's literally saying I'm not going to be boxed. And what I love about it as well is no matter what you've got, however little it is, you're making the most of what you've got. I love that we pull together a bit of this and a bit of that and a bit of this, and then you make this outfit that nobody else has got. And then you go out. I love the fact that people go out in a 3-piece suit to the market to buy fish with a cane and glasses and a top hat. Because why not celebrate every day like you're a king? I love that. And that's something that's so deeply Congolese. And it was something that I think it was Madeleine, I can't remember, one of you had said something about it's offensive not to dress up. Fact.